Are we good to go? You guys can hear me?
Yep, I think we're ready from our side.
Yeah. Okay. I'm looking through the names and it looks like we have everybody. So yeah, let me kick off this meeting. The February 2022 council meeting for the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. We have a couple presentations for the folks online today, and we're going to start with the Atlantic Sturgeon Bycatch Working Group. We have Spencer, who's with Garfo, and he's here to give us a presentation. So, Spencer, whenever I see your presentation online. So, yeah, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having me this morning and for the introduction. I will note that this presentation was also given to the New England Fishery Management Council during their February meeting last week. So for those of you who tuned in last week to that council meeting, this will look slightly different just because we've taken some feedback and tried to incorporate that. Next slide, please. So super basic information that just need to go over first. Atlantic sturgeon are slow growing, late maturing, anadromous fish that we have from Canada to Florida. Overfishing and habitat loss have caused drastic declines in their populations. And so as a result, we have 5 distinct population segments or DPSs all listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so the DPSs listed as endangered are Carolina, Chesapeake Bay, New York Bight, and the South Atlantic, and the Gulf of Maine is listed as threatened. And so our primary threats in the region for these fish are bycatch and trawl and gillnet fisheries and habitat degradation. Next slide, please. So on May 27th of last year, we released a Section 7 biological opinion considering the effects of authorization of 8 of our federal fishery management plans and 2 interstate fishery management plans, as well as the New England Fishery Management Council's Essential Fish Habitat Amendment. And so this biological opinion considered the impacts of the American lobster, bluefish, deep sea red crab, mackerel squid butterfish, monkfish, northeast multi-species skates, spiny dogfish, summer flounder, scup black sea bass, and Jonah crab fisheries on the impacts of those fisheries on our ESA listed species and designated critical habitat. And so that includes the impact of these fisheries on our Atlantic sturgeon DPSs. Next slide, please. The biological opinion includes an incidental take statement, and just for, again, more basic background, a take is defined as to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, or capture, or collect, or attempt to do any of those under ESA, any taking that's incidental and not the purpose of carrying out an otherwise lawful activity. In this case, the fisheries is not considered to be prohibited, and so that taking needs to be in compliance with the terms and conditions of an ITS issued in the biological opinion. So our May 27th biological opinion established an ITS with reasonable and prudent measures necessary to minimize the impacts of any incidental take, which are further broken down into implementing terms and conditions. And so the important part is these measures are non-discretionary and must be followed for the exemption for incidental takes to apply to the action. Next slide, please. So there are 2 RPMs or terms and conditions for RPMs in the biological opinion that I'm essentially here to talk to you about. The first states that NIMS will convene a working group to review all the available information on Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in the federal large mesh gillnet fisheries, defined in this PRD context defined in this protected resources context as greater than or equal to 7 inches stretched. Within 1 year of the publication of this opinion, the working group would develop an action plan to reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in these fisheries by 2024. And I'll note that the 1-year deadline then is May 27th, 2022. The action plan that we develop as a result of the previous RPM that I just went over must also include an evaluation of information available on post-release mortality, identification of data needed to better assess impacts, and a plan including timeframes for obtaining and using this information to evaluate impacts. So in order to fulfill the requirements of these terms and conditions, we formed the Atlantic Sturgeon Bycatch Working Group in late 2021. Initially, we included myself, Cynthia Ferrio, Lynn Lankshear, Jason Boucher, and Henry Milliken. Cynthia, Lynn, and I being from Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office, and Jason and Henry being from the Resource Evaluation and Assessment Division of the Science Center. Next slide, please. And so the reason, you might be wondering, that's all Garfo Center staff that we formed in our initial group, and you might be wondering why that is. And so we ran into early on the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which is a law that requires, it essentially formalizes the process to ensure that any advisory committees that the government forms are objective and accessible to the public. And so an advisory group is subject to the requirements of FACA if it meets all of the following conditions. It has at least one member who is not a federal employee. The group provides consensus advice, and the advice provided by the group deals with the operations of the federal government. Next slide, please. So if our advisory group that we formed to meet this biological opinion, or to meet the requirements of the biological opinion, was subject to FACA, we would have to, among other things, submit a formal request for the formation of the advisory committee, including rationale as to why the group is essential. We'd have to acquire the approval of the request by high-level officials of the sponsoring agency. We'd have to prepare a charter which would outline the committee's mission and duties, which would need to be reviewed by the GSA and complete a required notification period through the Federal Register. These are not all of the requirements, but is a slice. And I think the point of having all this here is to show that putting a group into place that would be subject to the Federal Advisory Committee Act and under its requirements would be complex and incompatible with the deadline that we have to complete the work of the group by May 27th of this year. And so initially, we determined that the best course of action would be to convene a group consisting only of NOAA fishery staff while implementing a public participation plan that we would make as robust as possible. Next slide, please. So both councils, in response to this initial step, recommended that NOAA Fisheries utilize an exemption from FACA, which would allow employees of state agencies to participate as members of the working group. This would provide more expertise to the group regarding both Atlantic sturgeon and the large mesh gillnet fisheries. And I think it's pretty straightforward to say that more expertise and knowledge added to a working group will generally improve.
Once again, I'll be working very closely with your department heads to have a clear sense.
Getting a
Where are
little-
we on community education on this?
Yeah, hold on a second, Spencer. Let's figure out where that sound's coming from.
Sure.
Should be good now.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so yeah, so generally having state partners involved to provide more expertise to our group would improve the products of the Atlantic Sturgeon Bycatch Working Group. We sent a letter to both councils on January 19th stating that we agreed with those recommendations to incorporate state participation into the working group, and the very next day we sent letters to state agencies from North Carolina to Maine. We have received responses from most states, not all, but as folks who've joined earlier may have heard Mike in reference to Maryland. We're still gathering everybody, so I hope to have as many people as possible. I will note that during the New England Fishery Management Council meeting, we did receive some feedback on this approach from both the New England Council and the ASMFC. The New England Council in particular noted that its preference was that the state, it had intended that a state employee be designated to the group that could also represent the position and perception of the New England Council. And so we took that feedback, and you'll see later we're kind of working through that rather than just the state employee operating fully in its state role, is the New England's position on that. But I'll get to that in a little moment. Next slide, please. So to get to actually, what the group is supposed to be doing, rather than all the setup, when the initial group of us from Garfo and the center convened for the first time, we developed a set of draft terms of reference, very basic, just to make sure that everybody's on board with, what the group is trying to do, and state very clearly what we're working towards. So the first term of reference was to produce a review of available bycatch information relevant to federal large mesh gillnet fisheries, including information on the spatial extended bycatch, characteristics of bycaught Atlantic sturgeon, such as age, sex, condition, length, and weight, post-release mortality, gear configurations most commonly associated with Atlantic sturgeon bycatch, and fisheries most commonly associated with Atlantic sturgeon bycatch. And so the second term of reference would be essentially dragged straight out of the BIOP, using that review, develop an action plan to reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in relevant fisheries by 2024. The scope of the action plan would be undefined right now and include specific actions by NIMS and partner organizations or specific modifications to fisheries management plans for relevant fisheries. I will note that these are very much very much working in progress type terms of reference. We're kind of modifying things as we realize that how we're phrasing or thinking about the work that we're trying to do has changed over time. So I don't want to call them draft because they're not really draft, but they are a working. You could call this a working document, I guess. Next slide, please. So just to go over where we are right now, for term of reference 1, in order to fulfill it, the working group is going to produce an introductory section of the action plan that we eventually come out with, which describes available bycatch information which was reviewed, summarizes commonalities between sources or general trends, and identifies information gaps. And likely we'll try to also identify ways in which those information gaps can be closed in the future. Next slide, please. So just a brief overview. In terms of metadata, we have about 9 peer-reviewed scientific papers dealing with just the distribution and occurrence of sturgeon, 2 dealing with Atlantic sturgeon bycatch analyses, a Northeast Fisheries Science Center model-derived estimate of bycatch. We have an ASMFC special report and the Northeast Fisheries Observer Program database, which contains observer data from 1989 to present. And so the scientific papers we reviewed include use methods including analyses of available observer program data, tagging and telemetry, DNA sampling and analysis, fisheries independent surveys, and remote sensing and modeling. 7 of the peer-reviewed papers that we've reviewed thus far have had a coast-wide study area, while 5 of them have focused on smaller study areas, including the waters off New York, Delaware Bay, and the Mid-Atlantic Bight. Next slide, please. And so just a brief summary of what the commonalities and trends that we've observed. We note that Atlantic sturgeon encounters these studies tend to agree that Atlantic sturgeon encounters tend to occur in waters less than 40 meters in depth. They occur coast-wide, but relatively more frequent off New York and Mid-Atlantic Bights. The Atlantic sturgeon encounters tend to be the highest in the spring and fall months. So April, May, September, and October are the 4 highest months for Atlantic sturgeon bycatch, and the lowest in summer months, which is important to note that our summer months are when some of our fisheries are most active, so that can tell us a lot about how some insight into how migratory patterns can affect bycatch. These seasonal patterns are likely related to migratory patterns of adult Atlantic sturgeon. These are caught more heavily in gillnet gear during those shoulder months. Multiple studies that we reviewed developed real-time modeling approaches to predict Atlantic sturgeon presence. So these would be useful tools to explore dynamic management schemes or generally as guidance when considering seasonal measures. And finally, Jason Boucher from the center has conducted some simple exploratory analyses of the available observer data that we have. Nothing that I'm prepared to show to you today, but just very we're looking good so far though. Next slide, please. So work on the term of reference 2, which is the action plan itself. Will proceed once state employees are integrated into the working group and we are considered to be complete or relatively complete with our work on term of reference number 1, which is the actual review of the information that we have. And so I want to be clear here that the action plan itself is going to be a document that, or it should be a document that will essentially provide a pathway towards getting some sort of action in place to reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch by 2024. It's not going to require or clearly state or mandate a specific type of action, but it would basically lay out that pathway. And so there are kind of two potential ways that the two potential pathways that could be in the action plan, and I think that there are trade-offs to either. So the reduction in sturgeon bycatch in action to do that could be achieved through an MSA action, which would affect FMPs with large mesh gillnet components. So, monkfish, dogfish, etc. Obviously, this would need time to move through council processes, both the Mid-Atlantic and the New England Fishery Management Councils, including adoption in 2023 priorities, if that is something that both councils want to do. The timing on this could be a little tight, given that our goal is to reduce bycatch by 2024. I think that my understanding is that it's not, the BIOP does not specify when in 2024 this bycatch reduction has to be achieved, but it does have to occur by the end of 2024. And so I think the timing on getting something on the council priorities list for 2023 put into place and actually measurably achieving this bycatch reduction could be fairly tight. And so that is one slight drawback. The benefit, though, is that this would provide a greater degree of public engagement and input in a way that we really value, obviously through the council system, and provides the opportunity to we really get that industry understanding of what's going on and input and things like that. The other side of the coin is an Endangered Species Act action that would implement requirements outside of MSA. This could theoretically allow for speedier development, not necessarily, but theoretically could, an implementation that can help us as the action agency for the authorization of these fisheries to meet the deadlines that are laid out in the biological opinion. This would still include the opportunity for public participation via public comment periods, other opportunities announced in the Federal Register. I imagine that we would hold some public meetings for input, but obviously it's not the same as going through the council process. And so it would look a little differently than what folks are used to. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned earlier that we had put together a public participation plan when we initially set about forming the working group. This is kind of what it looks like. We are planning a publication of an article in the NOAA Navigator, kind of walking through what I've just explained to you today and soliciting input from the public That is scheduled for the February issue, and I have to admit, I meant to check this morning to see if that was live yet, and I am not entirely sure if it is. If it isn't, it will be soon, I believe. Presentations during the council meetings, like this one and the one with the New England Council, and hopefully more in the future if possible. Publication of a notice in the Federal Register soliciting comment on the work that the Atlantic Sturgeon Bycatch Working Group has done, and further engagement if necessary. And I will note again that public comment during the New England Fishery Management Council meeting did highlight the need for additional public outreach to industry, and so we are cognizant of that desire and working to make that happen if we can. Next slide, please. And so next steps, again, securing state employee participation, making sure that everybody who needs to be or wants to be involved is involved. When we need to onboard those new members, get them acclimated to where we are, what we're doing, where we're going. Again, we definitely heard a lot of feedback saying from both the New England Council and the MAFMC that they were hoping for ways to engage meaningfully with the working group without triggering FACA requirements. We're working through the best way to do that right now. It's a pretty rapidly evolving discussion, so I'm hoping to be able to provide more information in the very near future. We would next steps need to finalize the first tour and the commits and continue work on the action plan in terms of reference number 2. And then finally gather public input throughout the process, enhance, make it better, follow the participation plan. And then I have my contact information here if folks feel that there is information about Sturgeon that they might want to make sure that we have. My contact information is here and available, and will be in both the it would also be available in any of the Federal Register of notices that we put out and the February edition of the NOAA Navigator. And so that's all I have. Next slide, please. I will note that I did receive a question via email. I don't know if the person who asked the question was going to be here today. I don't think I see them, so I don't know how I can either address that now or I can.
Yeah, who was it?
It was James Fletcher.
Yeah, we can see if that he would be part of the public comment, which we can get to,
Okay.
if he's here, that's great. But so when we get to the public comment, if you want to, you can speak to it at that point, but I'd like to start out with questions from the council.
Yep, that makes sense.
So thanks for the presentation. I've got Dewey Hemmelwright with his hand up. Go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the presentation. You mentioned numerous times about reducing the bycatch. It has to be reduced by, I think, 2024 or something. Where do we have to get to? What's the percentage? How many fish? What's the reduction number? Where do we got to get to? What's the number it has to be reduced by? Thank you.
So the biological opinion does not define that number, and so we don't have from that. We don't have a goal. Identifying the degree of reduction that needs to occur would be part of the process that I think would take place after the action plan is out, while councils or us develop any measures that need to be put in place. And I will note, give me 1 second, that generally I think that when we're talking about reasonable and prudent measures that are at part of biological opinions to reduce impacts, I think the goal there is to minimize those impacts to the extent practicable, resulting in no more than minor changes to the action. So it's not a clear number, but we would be looking to minimize bycatch to the extent practicable without causing anything more than a minor change to the fishery. So, how you would define that minor change, I'm not quite sure yet, but I think that it wouldn't result in, we're not going to shut down the entire eastern seaboard for, half the year. Like that would be a major change to the fishery, right? And so that would be out the door.
Yeah, that was kind of in line with what I was going to ask you about. It's as far as what you, so what your consideration for is like, what's a major change? And you just answered that, so that's good. We have a question from Chris Batsavage. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Spencer. You mentioned that this is really focused on gillnet fisheries of 7-inch mesh and greater, and I think you mentioned monkfish and spiny dogfish. I didn't realize that the spiny dogfish fishery also use mesh sizes larger than 7-inch. An additional question, or I guess the question I have is, are there any other gillnet fisheries in federal waters using mesh sizes in that range that aren't under council management, such as smooth dogfish or something like that, that NIMS is concerned about regarding sturgeon bycatch? Thanks.
I am not aware of any large mesh gillnet fishery not currently under council management that we are necessarily concerned with, but that is certainly something that I can, off the top of my head, I don't believe there is one that I'm aware of, but I can certainly try to look into that for you and provide more information. I think when we're thinking about this, we're mostly considering things like the dogfish, the spiny dogfish, monkfish, skates, the fisheries that are. I will note that the biological opinion covers the 10 fisheries, and so we're generally focusing on fisheries that are involved in that action. If you want to, I don't know what page it is. Let me roll up to it on my own here. 1 second. Yeah. So the biological opinion itself, the basis for which we're doing everything here, looks at the American lobster, the Atlantic bluefish, the Atlantic deep sea red crab, mackerel, squid, butterfish, monkfish, spiny dogfish, northeast multi-species of groundfish, northeast skate complex, summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and Jonah crab fisheries. So I think that the impacts of those fisheries are the ones that we're looking at.
Any follow-up? Chris? I have Chris Moore. Go ahead, Chris.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Spencer. I certainly would support the comments that you received from the New England Council and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission regarding our involvement with Sturgeon. Certainly looking forward to how you resolve that. And but the question, so that's clear. The other question I have for you relates to the plans for 2022 and 2023. Specifically, as I understand it, based on your presentation today, in 2022, the working group is going to be developing an action plan, right? And then that action plan is going to be input into the council process in 2023, possibly through the development of our 2023 implementation plan. Am I characterizing that correctly? Is that what you're thinking about? Is there something that I'm missing there?
I think that you are. I think that with maybe one thing I want to know. So the action plan itself needs to be published by May 27th of this year, and so I think the discussion that gets that action plan into the council process would occur over the summer of this year. And so I know that the New England Council's priority setting process occurs, at the the fall and the winter of each year. And so for them, we would likely we would try to get that conversation started there. I have to admit that I am not quite as familiar with the process that you folks have to here at the mid to get things on your radar and in your on your to-do list, so to speak. but that is my understanding of how things would work.
Yeah.
Good, Mr. Chair, just to follow up.
Go ahead, Chris. I was gonna talk about the process we go through, but please, if
Yeah.
you can help me out, you know it better than I do. So go ahead.
So Spencer, our process is somewhat similar, but different. We have, decision, initial conversation with the executive committee in October regarding the upcoming year's implementation plan. We have good discussion there, and then we move that forward into December. So the timing is pretty close to what you're thinking about for the New England Council, late fall. So yeah, I think that could work. So yeah, that's it. Thank you, Spencer, for your answers.
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna turn next to Chairman Eric Reed from New England. Go ahead, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you good.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Talmadge. I appreciate it. So, the working term of reference clearly says that the scope of the action plan is undefined. And it is my understanding that the working group membership is still in development, and the comments of New England and ASMFC last week are being considered but not actually addressed. So to me, this May 2022 deadline is a pretty aggressive, and I'm not sure if it's actually realistic. So my question is, what happens if NOAA is not able to complete the action plan by the May 2022 deadline? RPMs in the biological opinion they're non-discretionary. So if NOAA doesn't meet the deadline, can NOAA still permit the large gillnet fisheries moving ahead? Thank you.
So I don't know who else is on the call right now from my side. I would prefer to knock this question over to any of the protected resources folks that we have, or GC folks, just so that I don't.
Yeah. So Spencer, like, I'm looking at the names. What's a name? You want to throw a name out? Put somebody on the spot.
Yeah, I'm trying to look through the list myself. I don't know if I can put Lynn on the spot, but I think she would be better equipped to address this question than I am right
Okay.
now.
Yeah.
But she can feel free to deny me.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I hate to put you on the spot, Lynn, or not Lynn Fagley, but Lynn is it Langshire?
I think Bill Barnhill could also be put on the spot here, depending on
Okay.
either one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi there. This is Bill. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Bill. Yeah, we can hear you. You sound good.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that for you. Again, I think like Spencer said, we'd probably want to just double check with our attorneys and general counsel just to make 100% sure in terms of the regulations. But yeah, I don't see anything in there with the RPMs that says, if A, it doesn't happen, then B, has to happen in terms of, permitting lapses or things like that. I think if we can't meet that deadline, I'm sure we'll try to update folks as we go leading up to that, and then hopefully make some sort of either announcement or amendment potentially to that RPM and term and condition, which may give us some extra time or wiggle room there. So that's my initial thoughts. Again, don't quote me 100% on that. I think we'll definitely need to circle back to our leadership and our council staff, or sorry, our general council staff. But yeah, I don't think it's a black and white where, yeah, if that target isn't met, then things lapse the next day.
Right.
I think we can work that out and figure things out as we go. But obviously we're trying to hit that date as well as we can, and hopefully can meet it. But yeah, we will definitely have, I think, some contingency plan in place in the event that doesn't happen.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. Anyone else from the council? I know we had some public interest. Just scrolling. Just give me a second here. Bob Beal. Go ahead, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right,
Sound good?
Great, thanks. And Spencer, thanks again for the presentation. I won't rehash all the comments I made at the New England Council, but just trying to figure out where we go from here. You know, I do think since ASMSC maintains a number of the FMPs that are included in the biological opinion, you know, the involvement of ASMSC would be helpful and important. So, given your comments today, is our likely involvement going to be kind of after the plan is developed, you know, hopefully by the end of May, sort of reacting to that? Or do you think there's going to be another role for ASMC and maybe the councils prior to that plan being developed? It sounded like you're saying, you know, we'd possibly bring something back to the councils anyway in June or so of this year. Is that something that ASMFC should anticipate, or are you thinking about a different role moving forward?
So I think that's the decision that we're weighing. I think that's what you have outlined there. I think is close to where we are, but I can't speak for certain that that's the decision that we would make on how to get you how to best get you involved. So I think I can't quite answer that yet, but that is kind of the direction that I think that we're headed. To, you know, the action plan, like I said, is a roadmap to getting where we need to be, and you know, once that is published in May, you know, what we have outlined will not be set in stone, right? And feedback to that plan will, I think, play a major role in the measures that are developed moving forward. I don't know if that was
Bob,
satisfying.
yeah. So thanks, Spencer. Bob put his hand back up, so let me go back to Bob and see if he had a follow-up. Go ahead, Bob.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think you covered it a little bit at the end of your comments and response, Spencer, but I guess, you know, what magnitude of changes can be made to the action plan once it's published or drafted? You know, is it, you know, sort of wide open allowance for additions, omissions, or is it, you know, only minor tweaks? You know, I guess I'm concerned if you know, if there's not a lot of flexibility once the initial action plan is published, that makes me a little bit nervous. But if it's, you know, if there's a lot of latitude and things can change significantly, if you know, once you get to the public and commissions and councils, if there is a lot of flexibility there, then I'm a little bit less nervous.
Any comments, Spencer? Or
Yeah, I want to make sure that I address this in the best way.
yeah,
I think that, you know, I think that it would be hard to pin down like a degree of flexibility at this point. I think that it would be fair to say that I expect, you know, a moderate degree of flexibility, right? To be able to say, okay, well, the action plan has, you know, lays out our problems that we have with Sturgeon Bycatch, lays out, you know, possible solutions to these problems and measures that could implement those solutions, or a range, like different ranges of measures that could possibly address those problems, right? And so, you know, I expect the ability to say, hey, you guys are looking at these types of changes to federal fishery management plans. You know, you should consider, you know, changing the scope of these changes to, you know, maybe to include, you know, XYZ in what you're looking at. I think that it would be different to say, hey, you know, we think that you guys have like totally missed a problem with Sturgeon, you know, and you haven't developed any sort of measures to examine that problem, or a path towards examining that problem, and we think you should include that. Like, I don't know if we would be able to adapt that kind of change. I hope that makes sense. like I said, I think kind of a moderate degree of change. I don't think it's a rigid hard thing, but I also don't think that it's totally freeform.
Bob, are you good?
Yeah, I'm all set. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, all right. So let me ask if the, any other council members, I see Dan Farnham's hand. Go ahead, Dan.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. I see at one point there was a mention that ESA action could implement requirements outside of MSA. When would that decision be made? Is that something that would be done concurrently with the council actions, or would it be at what point would that decision be made? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
That's a good question. I think part of the, putting an item on the council priorities list, right, is or the mids equivalent, involves the council actually wanting to do the action right. And so I think that if we reach the situation where both either councils said, hey, we don't think that any of this, I'm not suggesting that this is what you guys folks actually think, but if we were in a situation where neither of the councils really wanted to take anything on, or the priorities that are set that would take on action weren't quite sufficient, I think that then we would explore action outside the MSA to make sure that the requirements that we have to reduce sturgeon bycatch are met.
Okay.
Yep, very good. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for the question and the comment. I'm going to go to the public. I see a few hands that came up. So I've got James Fletcher. Go ahead, James.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, you're a little faint, but yeah, speak up if you can.
I sent in some information where other countries are spawning sturgeon and releasing. The Magnuson Act allows for enhancement. My question is, can NOAA, National Marine Fisheries, and the Council fund hatcheries to raise the sturgeon to 24 to 30 inches and thereby offset any sturgeon that are harvested in the wild accidentally? The situation is do we know one female sturgeon will release X number of eggs? What percentage of those eggs will live if they are put in water that has chlorine in it? Because the problem is we're not addressing the water quality where the eggs are. And we're going to put in a bycatch reduction plan and not address the true problem, which is the spawning of the sturgeon and the survival. So I guess my main question is, can NOAA, National Marine Fisheries, the Council, and ASMFC take the money that they use for the meetings and put into the actual spawning and release of sturgeon at 1 year old, which is 24 inches? Can we stop reducing bycatch and start producing sturgeons and returning them to the wild? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can't really, I think that the main point of this presentation, my role and our role is the National Marine Fisheries Service in this context of the biological opinion that was issued to examine specifically the 10 fisheries that I listed earlier. Our role in the context of that is to look at bycatch of Atlantic sturgeon and reduce it. Sturgeon, like a number of our ESA listed species, face a number of stressors, which may include water quality. And so, but it definitely in this case includes bycatch. And so addressing one stressor, bycatch, that affects the population of sturgeon, the population of sturgeons that we have, does not take away from any other efforts to address other stressors like habitat, water quality, ship strikes, etc. I don't have a lot of off the top of my head information about work that's going on in those arenas, but I do know that it is occurring, and I could find more information if that's desired.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I appreciate the comment. I'm gonna go next to Greg DiDomenico.
Good
Greg,
morning,
are you
Mike.
there?
Yeah, good morning, Mike. Can you hear me?
There you go. Yep, we hear you good.
Just a few short questions for Spencer, if that's okay.
Of course, yeah.
Good morning, Spencer. Greg DiDomenico, Lund's Fisheries. Could you go back to your term of reference slide?
I believe that would be slide
Yeah,
9, please.
are you?
I'm not controlling it.
You're not controlling it. All right.
Yeah, there we go. What's up?
Thank you.
There you go.
Didn't get a chance to read the entire thing before, but would you also add to a characteristic that you would analyze, which would be, regional fishing practices such as soak time?
I'm writing that down. I mean, yeah, and that's the kind of feedback that we're looking to hear from folks in things like this, and our navigator and anything else that we put out is information that you think that we need to be looking at.
Okay.
It's certainly something that we can look at.
Also, I don't know if you can do it on the fly here, but could you explain how you came to 7-inch as a variable for further analysis?
So my understanding is that the 7 inches is the definition on the protected resources side of the house in terms of what constitutes a large mesh gill net. And I think that I'm not sure how the RPM was developed such to target specifically those that cutoff point. But I do think it has largely to do with the fisheries that we're seeing, sturgeon, bycatch, and primarily the monkfish and some of those other fisheries.
Okay. Also, and just to reiterate, your mentioning the spatial extent of bycatch, you are primarily talking about depth. Am I correct?
Both depth and parts of the coast in which we see a lot of bycatch. I think that for example, one of the things, and this is just purely a straw man example, not to be taken as like word of written in stone, but like an example of a type of measure that could be put into place, for a fishery, nondescript fishery, to reduce bycatch. If you saw that there were specific migratory corridors off of, let's say, the Mid-Atlantic Bight during certain periods of time, you could develop, you could theoretically develop a seasonal closure area to attempt to stamp down on bycatch in that area. Again, that's a possibility. And so understanding how deep and where geographically bycatch is occurring is something that would help the council's ordinance develop measures that address that bycatch.
Okay, two more, Spencer. I'll be quick.
Sure.
You mentioned further analysis of other fisheries. What were they again? Or were you just talking about them being in the initial biological opinion?
So I think that was in reference to a question about fisheries that we may not have regulated under FMPs through the council process. I think that it took me a second to get to the right answer there, and I think that the right answer is that we're looking at impacts caused by fisheries that were analyzed in the biological opinion.
Okay. And last one is regarding the issue of the deadline, meeting the deadline. Are you saying, or are you, I mean, sir, I'm concerned that if we don't meet the deadline, some fisheries would not be issued their permits? Is that a possibility?
I don't think that that is necessarily a possibility, although I am, like I said, I bounced this question off to Bill Barnhill earlier, and I don't know that we have the, I don't know that I am able to straight up say no to that. I don't think that that would be, that sounds like, I don't think that that would be a result, but we are definitely aware of how rapidly that deadline is approaching, and we are going to make sure that we meet it.
Thank you, Spencer.
All right, thanks, Greg. Thanks, Spencer. I'm going to go to an ASMFC Commissioner, Emerson Hasbrook. Go ahead, Emerson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Spencer, for your presentation. And Spencer, I just wanted to thank you for considering the comments that were brought up at the New England Fishery Management Council about incorporating more specific opportunities for fishing industry input in this process. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emerson. Appreciate the comment. So on my screen, I see it says C. Lands Lozano.
Oh, it's Carlos Lozano from AKRF Inc. Thank you.
Yeah. Go
Okay.
ahead. You
Just
say
have
your
a-
name is Carlos?
Yes, correct. Carlos Lozano.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just have a question and just general comment. And I know it's very early in the process, but regarding target measures of reduction in bycatch, I was wondering if things such as standardizing reductions to population sizes have been considered. In some population segments like the Chesapeake Bay, there's potentially going to be trends and increasing population size. And also my comment was regarding the measures, the approaches for reducing the bycatch. I think in order to come up with a plan on reducing bycatch, one of many things that needs to be done is getting a good idea of the habitats where sturgeon occupy, as well as their migratory corridors. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Carlos. I appreciate that. Appreciate your comment. Anyone else from the public? Okay, I don't see any other hands. So let me thank Spencer for your time today. Hopefully you got something out of the back and forth discussion with the council, and thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think our next agenda item is going to start. Let me look at my notes here. 11 o'clock. So let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 11 and pick up on the recusal briefing. John, are you ready to go at 11?
I am. I think Shelly has my PowerPoint, so I guess I'll just work.
Okay.
Oh, there it is. Great.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm good to go.
It just popped up. Okay. Yeah, we'll take 5 minutes and we'll come back in 5. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I'd like to get into our next item on the agenda this morning. We have John Almeida with with NOAA's General Counsel here to talk about recusals. This isn't something that comes up a lot with our council, but we'll see what John has to say and go from there. So John, if you're there and ready, floor is yours.
Yep, I'll set Mike. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, and welcome to the 2022 briefing on financial disclosures and recusals, where we get new council members on board every year, and some of the points here can get a little complicated. I think it's a good idea to walk through this each year. And if folks have questions, I'll do my best at the end to answer them. And if I can't, I'll try to track them down before our next meeting. Could I get the next slide, please? At their core, government ethics statutes and regulations are about ensuring that public officials place the public interest over their own private gain. Taxpayers reasonably expect that public officials are not in their position for their own private interests. And the framework we have in place with ethics regulations helps ensure that that'll happen. It's important to recognize that federal ethics regulations are not the same as our everyday understanding of ethics, which are based on personal moral codes. Federal ethics regulations are strict rules that everyone must follow, regardless of whether we believe that we can personally be objective in our decision making. Next slide, please. The statutes and regulations are very strict for federal officials when it comes to working on matters in which the official has a personal financial interest. And this slide shows the default standard, which is basically we can't do it. And if we do, we could face criminal or civil penalties. Council members are considered federal officials for purposes of federal ethics rules. Next slide. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, however, gives council members an exception to this blanket prohibition on working on matters where the official may have a personal financial interest. And this is largely because in setting up the council system, Congress decided it wanted to have folks with expertise in fisheries management. And if the strict default standards applied, we likely wouldn't get that kind of expertise. Next slide, please. Okay, so this section of Magnuson sets up the requirement that council members must disclose their financial interest and must recuse themselves from voting on matters where there would be a significant and predictable effect on their financial interests. Again, this standard is different than the default that we saw a few slides ago. The default is no involvement whatsoever, where there's anything beyond a minimal financial interest in the matter. Here, the Magnuson standard allows for involvement as long as it won't lead to a significant and predictable effect. Again, Congress did this because it wanted to ensure that people with experience and expertise are sitting at the council table working on fisheries issues. And the default standard would likely require a whole lot of recusals from involvement. And as this slide shows, this is the standard that applies to council members, not to NIMFs or state officials. Next slide, please. Disclosure of the financial interest is the key to the ethics framework here. Disclosures put everything out in front so members of the public can understand where council members are coming from, which fisheries they're involved in, what companies they work for or own. The carrot for disclosure is that disclosing your involvement allows your participation in discussions and deliberations, even in a situation where a matter would lead to a significant and predictable effect on a council member's interest. Next slide, please. Of course, there's also a stick, as the failure to disclose or false disclosures are violations of Magnuson, which can result in civil penalties, permit sanctions, and even removal from the council. They could also result in the provisions of Section 208 kicking in, meaning potential civil or criminal penalties. So along with the carrot, you get the stick. Next slide, please. So there are three general categories of required disclosures. And the first is the most common one that we look at, and that's ownership or employment in a company or vessel engaged in a fishery managed by the council. The second is employment in an organization whose members are engaged in a fishery. And the third is ownership or employment in a company that is owned or owns another company engaged in a fishery managed by the council. And this third category relating to indirect ownership gets to some of the more complicated situations and calculations that I'm going to talk about later on. There's two other categories that don't appear on this slide that are less common. And those are, first, employment ownership in a company that provides essential equipment or services for a fishery. And second, employment or ownership in a company that provides representational, consulting, legal services for other companies involved in harvest, marketing for fisheries in the council. But those are less common. I don't think I've dealt with either of those yet. Next slide, please. Okay, whose interest must be disclosed? Your own, your spouse, your minor children, your partners, and any organization where you serve as an officer, director, trustee, partner, or employee. So those are pretty straightforward. The one question that came up a few years ago was whether partner meant a business partner or a romantic partner, or both. I consulted with some attorneys in NOAA GC, and the perspective is that the intent was that it refers to business partners because of the context where it borrowed this language from the Office of Government Ethics. And in the language that the Office of Government Ethics uses, it was the phrase general partner, and it didn't have any connection to a romantic partner. So other than the use of the term partner here, everything else from the Office of Government Ethics regulations was brought over. So it appears that the intent is that it should be a business disclosure of your business partner's interest, not your romantic partner, who doesn't happen to be a spouse. Let's put it that way. Next slide, please. Okay, this one is important, the timing of disclosures. We get them each year by February 1st. When you join the council, new members need to get them in within 45 days. But the bold here is very important. If things change during the year, we need to get an update within 30 days. So if something substantially changes within that time, we need to get an update from council members. Next slide, please. Okay, with disclosures, there's an explicit presumption in the regs that the disclosures are true and accurate, and that the designated official for making these determinations on recusals, who's usually going to be me, may not be digging in to determine their accuracy based on this presumption. Again, this presumption relies on the Magnuson requirements for actual accurate disclosures. Going back to that concept of the carrot and the stick. But at the same time, this presumption doesn't necessarily preclude me from digging in or relying on other information if it is available. Again, because of the importance of accurate disclosures, I'd urge council members to work with Dr. Moore or myself if you're running into questions or difficulties with your disclosures. Next slide, please. The other piece relating to the disclosures, and this is important, if you don't list a specific percentage of ownership, the presumption is going to be 100%. So you will get 100% of whatever is listed attributed to you unless you specifically indicate that it's less than that. So if you own a 1% share in some other company that has a sizable portion of a fishery within the council's management, and you don't report that it's only 1%, you're going to get that full 100% attributed to you. So again, this is important. You know, when you're talking about shares of ownership, make sure you indicate just the specific percentage that you actually own. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the question: what happens if there is a recusal required? You'll see the answer in the first bullet, and note the bolded phrases. The statute tells us that recusal is required when there's a council decision that would have significant and predictable effect on financial interests that are required to be disclosed. So when a council member is aware of this, the council member can voluntarily recuse him or herself without going through the process of asking for GC review. Next slide, please. So we have, you know, these steps that we walk through as to when we would need to recuse ourselves from a council vote. And we're going to walk through these steps in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. Okay, the first question, is there a council decision? The regulations define council decision as you see in this slide. So these are the council decisions that could be subject to recusal. If what we're talking about isn't within these categories, then it's not going to be something that anyone would have to recuse themselves from. So like priorities, something like that. You don't see that on this list. It's not going to be something we recuse ourselves from. So next slide, please. So here's some examples of what isn't a council decision. You know, committee motions, even a committee recommendation going to the council is not a council decision. Likewise, council motions and deliberations that lead up to, you know, an amendment decision are not council decisions subject to recusal. So preliminary steps that take you through an amendment are not, you would not need to recuse yourself from those. Specifications or frameworks that don't have implementing regulations, those don't fall under the list of council decisions subject to recusals. So if we're not dealing with, you know, that somewhat limited list of items to which recusals are required, we don't need to get into a recusal question. Next slide, please. Okay, remember the phrases from a few slides ago: a council decision with a significant and predictable effect. So the statute tells us that a significant and predictable effect is when there's a close causal link between the council decision and an expected and substantially disproportionate benefit to a council member's financial interest against the financial interests of other participants in the same fishery. Again, the two highlighted phrases are defined in the regulations. Next slide, please. So close causal link is defined as when a council decision would reasonably be expected to directly impact or affect the financial interests of an affected individual. The regulations flesh this out a little bit, telling us that when there's implementing regulations for a decision, generally there's a presumption of a close causal link. And when there's no regulations, there's a presumption that there isn't a close causal link. Now, whether there's an exception to these presumptions, it really hinges on the facts of the situation. If you have a situation where there are regulations, but it's, you know, speculative that they'll have any causal connection to a council member's financial interest, let's say like a reporting requirement, where it's, you know, a change to a reporting requirement, where you have to include a phone number where you didn't before, you know, just as an example. Chances are that, you know, we could look at that and say, is that likely to have any connection to someone's financial interest? And if it won't, that's going to be an exception to the presumption. And then, you know, the flip side, there could be a situation where there's no regulations, but there's a real non-speculative expectation that there'd be a causal connection to the council member's financial interests. So even though we have these presumptions, we should probably I would urge folks to talk with me or Chris or both of us to work through whether the presumption is in, whether the presumption applies or whether an exception applies in a given situation. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next key phrase, expected and substantially disproportionate benefit, is defined in the regulations as a positive or negative impact with regard to a council decision that is likely to affect a fishery or a sector of a fishery in which the affected individual has a significant financial interest. So what is the significant financial interest? Next slide, please. It's basically that magic number of greater than 10% interest in the harvesting, marketing, or processing of a fishery, or greater than 10% of the vessels using the same gear type in the fishery affected by a council decision. So that 10% number is very important. And if you're below that 10%, for the most part, recusals won't be an issue. Next slide, please. Okay, attribution. How much of an interest do we impute on a council member? We'll look at a couple of, the common situations here. The first two situations are pretty straightforward, but the second two can get complicated. So the first one, direct ownership. So for a council member's direct ownership in a company, the percentage of ownership that's used to calculate the interest, just basically that it's a straightforward, how much of the company does the council member own? If council member Bob owns 10% of a company that has a 50% interest in harvesting a fish that's regulated by the council, ownership of 10% of the company with 50% of the interest will take you to a 5% attributable ownership. And that would be, below that magic 10% number. Now with employment, it's full attribution. So all of a council member's employer's interests will be considered for recusal purpose. So the same situation, instead of owning a portion of the company, council member Bob works for the company, then the full 50% interest will be attributed to Bob, and that would take you over the 10%. Now with indirect ownership, you have a company that owns another company. It's proportional attribution. So if councilmember Bob owns 50% of a company and that company owns 50% of a second company, then councilmember Bob will be attributed with 25% of that second company's interests. So if that second company harvests 50% of the orange fish fishery, say that's a new FMP we have, then councilmember Bob will be attributed with 12.5% of that fishery. And that would take Bob over the 10%. Let's see. Okay, then the final situation, parent ownership. So a company that owns part of a council member's company. It's full attribution if the parent company owns 50% or more. So if a council member's company is partially owned 50% by the council member, and another company owns 50%, then the second company, all of their interests will be attributed to council member Bob. So then if that second company has, 10% interest in some fishery managed by the council, then that 10% is going to be attributed to Bob. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a kind of an unusual situation, but organizations, you don't have any attribution from if you have a fishing organization, you don't attribute the members of the organization's fishing activities to a council member. But if the association itself engages in fishing, then the association's activities would be attributed to the council member. if the council member is employed or a member, not a member, but employed by or an officer within a fisheries organization. The next point regarding ownership interests of a spouse, partner, or minor child, we again use the proportional attribution described in the last slide. But when we're talking about employment, that doesn't get attributed to the council member unless the compensation fluctuates based on the financial performance of the company. So if it's straight salary or an hourly wage, it doesn't get attributed to the council member. But if the compensation is tied to how the company does, then it does get attributed to the council member. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do these recusal questions get started? Usually it's by the request of a council member, but they can come about by NOAA GC initiating the process. Typically before a council meeting, Chris and I will talk, and if there's a pending issue that's on the agenda, that might raise questions that would, start up the analysis. I would urge council members to contact me if you have a question, and the more lead time, the better. From the last couple of slides, particularly the attribution questions, excuse me, the questions can get kind of tricky. So I'd urge, sooner than later when we need to start asking these questions. Next slide, please. And remember, even if you are recused, that only keeps you from the final vote. You can still participate in the committee process. You can participate in the process and the motions leading up to, the decision on the applicable recused action. And you can even participate in the discussions and deliberations on the final vote. You just need to announce your recusal. And you can even announce how you would have voted had you been able to. So again, this is the carrot of disclosures is, even if you need to recuse yourself, you still can participate in a pretty substantial way in the process up to the point of a vote. Next slide, please. And, to the extent that there's disagreement with how GC comes out on these recusal questions, there is a process for review higher up the chain. And again, the earlier you start this process, the better, because, by the regs, this can, the higher ups would get 30 days to make a decision. And if we don't start the process until right before a council meeting, it could be too late. And as the council as the slide notes, a reversal on a recusal determination can't undo a council decision. So we can't go back in time and redo a vote that, allows someone to vote. It's sort of like the ship has left the dock. So again, this goes back to the theme I've mentioned several times. The sooner we can address these questions, the better, because, here's just another reason. If there's disagreement and you want to take advantage of this appeal type process, we need time. We need time to make that happen. Next slide, please. This is one kind of rare situation where there could be a recusal. It doesn't happen very often, but if a council is considering a matter that's primarily an individual concern of a council member, then a council member must be recused and in this situation cannot participate in deliberations. And this is a rare situation. And an example might be something like a grant or a contract that the council member would be applying for, something like that. That would require recusal under this separate section of the regulations. I was trying to imagine a fishery decision where this would take place, and it would have to be a fishery with very few participants or an issue in a fishery that only affected a few companies. Maybe maybe something to do with an EFP or something like that. But it's going to be a very rare scenario. But this is the only situation where a recusal would require that a person not only recuse themselves but not participate in the discussions or deliberations. Next slide, please. Here's a slide with some resources on recusal questions. And you may recall not too long ago, the regulations were changed, and there were some changes between the proposed and final rules based on submitted comments. So that's why we have, both the proposed and the final here, because it might help folks understand where the rule ended and why it ended that way. In addition to these resources, there's a NIMS procedures document in today's meeting materials. And it includes some examples of how, some of those attribution hypotheticals that might help people understand some of those concepts a little better. So, again, wrapping up, one thing that I would like folks to take away from this presentation is that these recusal questions can get complicated based on the facts, and I'm here to help you work through those. And if I can't figure it out, then there's others within NOAA GC who are great with these issues, who I can, ask for their assistance. But the more time we get to work on them, the better. So, as soon as you see something coming up, or you want to get ahead of these things, please pick up the phone or shoot me an email. That's all I have today. And if I can take questions if folks have them, and I'll answer them best I can. And if I can't answer them, I'll do my best to get answers before the next meeting.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm not sure that I'm the only one right now that feels stressed. But it's all good. It's great presentation. I appreciate putting that all together. And let me see if anyone has any questions. I guess I'm not trying to make like a lawyer joke, but sometimes all this legal stuff can get people a little stressed and upset. But let's see if anyone has any questions for John. Chris Moore? Go ahead, Chris.
You, Mr. Chair. Thanks, John, for
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
presentation. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. So, John, Stephen, can you go to slide 20? Slide deck. So one thing, John, when you presented the slide, you said, this is, 10% is like the magic number, and certainly one that you and I have talked about over the years. So rarely is something that the Mid-Atlantic Council gets involved with, but occasionally we have over the last 10 or 11 years that I've been executive director. More often than not, questions this particular slide on the slide. So when you talk about 10%, it's important for folks to understand 10% of what, right? So we've had issues about, is that 10% of what a state lands in terms of a particular species as it relates to black sea bass? Or is it 10% of the coastwide harvest that we're talking about? Is it 10% of all the vessels along the coast that are involved in a particular fishery? Or is it 10% of the vessels in a particular port? So if you could just address that a little bit, I think that would be helpful, council, to hear that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, and this is one of those, lawyer answer. It depends. It goes to the nature of the council decision that we're talking about. So if there's a council decision that is across the board, say, some would affect the entirety of black sea bass fishing or something like that, then we wouldn't necessarily dig down into, well, this company has over 10% of the fishery in one particular state or one particular region, because the council decision is going across, all fisheries, all sectors within the black sea bass fishery. But there could be a situation where maybe there's some council decision that's going to a more regional or focused piece of a larger fishery. So if you have a council decision that's really just going to, maybe a closure area that would only affect the southern region of the black sea bass fishery. So geographically, that would, kind of limit the analysis would be shaped by that. So it kind of depends on, the question that the council is taking up as to what the 10% of what, right? So I guess that's, I don't know, maybe that helps. Maybe Chris, is there more specific that I could provide? I'm not sure.
Well, no, I think that's helpful, John. And I think, again, it's important for folks to understand that because, again, we have been involved in specific where the 10% has become important. And we've had, and basically, if we get in those situations, as John indicated, council certainly track it too, right? So John, as John indicated, we'll have a conversation before a council meeting. And in the past, what we've done is identify specific actions and then specific individuals that we need to contact or talk to relative to, what exactly this means, right? And typically, we found situations where it doesn't apply, even though we think, well, maybe this does, given the conversation. But once we explore it, we decide that in fact that individual doesn't have to recuse themselves. And while I have the mic, the other situations where we've been involved with recusal conversations involve tilefish. And I think Dan Farnham knows about those conversations and certainly understands where we're at with that. But again, I think the bottom line is exactly what you said, John. You need to understand, from your individual perspective, exactly what this means for you. And if there's questions, then you need to reach out to John or me, and we'll.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. John, did you want to address that at all?
No, I mean, I think, what Chris is getting to is, the piece I harped on, throughout this presentation is the more time
Right.
that we can hash through.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, if there's a question, call you and start the conversation. Right? I mean, that's what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other members of the council? Looking through my screen, I don't see anything. Anyone from the public have any questions for John? Yeah, I don't see anything right now. So, it is 11:35. Let me ask Chris, and maybe Tony's on. Is it best to go to 1 o'clock? because we have the meeting with the board at 1 o'clock. What do you guys think? It's probably best to do 1 o'clock.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, start at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
sorry.
think my computer like totally, yeah, I lost all my connection for a second. So, yeah. So what do you think? 1 o'clock? We'll get back.
We noticed that the meeting would start at 1 o'clock, so,
Yeah, I think that's good. Okay. All right, so we'll go on lunch break until 1 o'clock, and we'll see you all back then. Thank you.